As a result of the riots, 18 people died and more than 170 were injured. Besides the Singapore police, the British and Malayan armed forces were called in to restore order. This example shows that if religious issues are not handled carefully, it can give rise to hostility between religious groups, and it can trigger violence in Singapore. If a riot like that takes place again, Singapore will be affected in many ways. The first of this is the destruction of property. During both the Maria Hertogh and the race riots, rioters flipped cars over and set them on fire. Also, naturally, people would die or get injured. People will also live in fear and suspicion, and it would disrupt their day-to-day activities like going to work or going to school. Singapore's economic growth will fall because foreign investors would be reluctant to invest in a country during times of instability. So far, we've learned about internal threats, which means threats that come from within Singapore, from Singaporeans. But threats can also come from external forces. Transnational terrorism refers to acts of violence that have global aims, organization, and impacts. This can be a threat to the social bonds between Singaporeans. Oh, you have to remember this definition, okay? Definition. If you remember, the ISD exhibition came to our school recently, and if you were paying attention, the man from ISD told us about threats from the Jemaah Islamiyah. Hang on, let me spell that for you. Jemaah Islamiyah. And how Singaporeans can be radicalized through the internet. Like if you read up on your religion online and you stumble upon some websites or video channels that give you the wrong idea about your religion, you may start to become an extremist. The race riots and the Maria Hertogh riots have taught us that religion is a very sensitive issue. Religious organizations from outside Singapore can use race and religion to fan the flames and create divisions between racial and religious groups in Singapore. This may be a threat to our racial and religious harmony. The Jemaah Islamiyah, oh good, it's spelled here. It's a militant group that originated from Indonesia. It's very active there, and it even had its own website up until 2013. It has terrorist cells in several Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and even Singapore. Their aim is to set up their own Islamic state in Asia. They were responsible for the Bali bombings. For the Bali bombings in 2002 and the planned attacks. And they also planned attacks on Yishun MRT station. If you're paying attention during the ISD exhibition, you will remember that around 1999, the JI planned to set off a bomb at Yishun MRT right here in Singapore because they were hoping to target soldiers from the nearby naval base. They also planned to bomb several embassies in Singapore. One of our government's counter-terrorism measures, hang on, let me write that down. Counter-terrorism. One of our measures is the Internal Security Act, also known as ISA. Under this act, the government has the right to detain a person without trial for up to 2 years if the person is suspected of being a threat to Singapore. This means that the government can detain a terrorist who is suspected of planning attack against Singapore, even if he hasn't actually taken action yet. This act was very useful. It enabled the arrests of 34 JI members during the period 2001 to 2002. That was around the time of the Yishun plot. They were arrested for activities like raising funds for the JI and buying materials to make bombs, like fertilizer. I think we bought a few tons of fertilizer. Muslim leaders Well, leaders of the Muslim community in Singapore condemned the JI group for their extremist views. The leaders also emphasized that the Muslim community in Singapore does not agree with extremism. But the reaction of the general public was mixed. Some people started to treat Malays with suspicion and distrust. The government realized that in order to stop people from generalizing, there must be more integration between the different racial and religious groups in Singapore. To hold our society together, there are three methods. First off is building a national identity. It's like building this umbrella. Let me try and draw an umbrella that all the racial and religious groups can bond together under. Like, for example, I may be a Chinese Christian or Chinese Christian, but I am also Singaporean. National identity is something that we all have in common. It's this big umbrella here. Another method is to ensure that the interests of the minority groups are not ignored. Minority groups refers to Malays and Indians. For example, if the minority groups in Singapore are unhappy with something, then it has to be addressed and not ignored. Finally, we must develop a common space to be shared by all Singaporeans. Let's start with building a national identity. One of the main pillars of our society is the concept of multiracialism. Okay, you need to know this. The idea that all races are equal and treated equally and of equal value. No particular race is treated any better than another race. If you're paying attention just now, multiracialism is the exact opposite of Malaysia's Bumiputra policies. Remember that Bumiputra policies means that the indigenous Malays, the original inhabitants of the land, are treated better than the Chinese and Indians. This is what happens in Malaysia. So there's no special rights granted to any particular racial or religious group here in Singapore. Oh, this is important. Equal opportunities to succeed. It's a concept called meritocracy. Hang on, I'll write it down. Meritocracy. It means that regardless of your background, what race you are, regardless of your socio-economic status, everyone has an equal chance to succeed. Everyone has an equal chance to do well in school, to earn money, to do business. So the basic idea of multiracialism is that every racial group has the same value. No race is better than another. No race is superior to another. We build national identity through having shared practices that every Singaporean does. Shared practices. For example, all Singaporeans sing the national anthem. You sing this every day, yeah? And we also take the pledge in the morning. Oh, you know, if you switch on your TV at around 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. in the morning and you switch to Channel 5 or Channel 8, the TV station plays the national anthem and you can join in on the singing. So this is how adults, very patriotic adults, can join in on singing the national anthem even though they've graduated from school ages ago. We are trained from young to take part in these daily rituals. Let me write that down. Rituals. We are trained from young to take part in these daily rituals, and these rituals are what make us Singaporean. Even if you don't meet everyone, every single person in Singapore, you don't really shake their hand and say hi, we are still all united under the same banner because of these daily rituals. It helps to build a sense of belonging and loyalty towards Singapore. If you want to read more about this, it's called The Theory of Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson. If you want to read more, of course. Next. Another method to maintain harmony in Singapore is to protect the interests of the minority groups like the Indians and Malays. We have something called PRC, which stands for Presidential Council of Minority Rights. It consists of people from minority races and religions. And we also have GRC. See, it's very easy to remember. We also have GRC, which is Group Representation Constituency. If you're not clear about GRCs, you should pause this video now and go and ask your parents about it. For example, I'm sure most of you live in Bedok, because you know we're Bedok North, and Bedok is under Aljunied GRC. So there are about 5 MPs, members of parliament, representing Aljunied, and it is compulsory for at least one of them to be a member of a minority group. So each GRC has at least one Malay or Indian to ensure that the interests of the Malay or Indian community is being represented in parliament. So if there's a certain problem that affects only the Malays and Indians, then at least they have a representative to bring it up in parliament on their behalf. Okay? Remember to ask your parents, it's quite interesting. Also, besides GRC and PRC, we also have racial self-help groups. Each race has its own association to look out for its interests. Like for example, CDAC helps the Chinese, SINDA helps the Indians, Mendaki helps the Malays, and this one is quite obvious. CDAC stands for Chinese Development Assistance Council. You can Google this on your own. And it provides social support to Chinese people, whereas Mendaki is in charge of looking after Malay people. This ensures that people from each race are given social support by their own races, and it helps the minority groups to compete on equal footing with the rest of the nation. If you remember the race riots of 1964, if you're paying attention, the race riots of 1964 were partly because the Malays felt unhappy that they were poorer and less educated than the Chinese. They had lower socio-economic status. But ever since Mendaki was formed, it has helped to close the gap between the races and improve the social and economic position of the Malay community. Finally, to develop a cohesive society and maintain it, we need to develop a common space in which people from different races and religions can interact with each other. If we get to know each other, then we can get along better. It's important for Singaporeans to know each other on an individual level because then we can look past our differences. Like, I wouldn't say, hey, that's my Indian neighbor. I would say, that's my neighbor. His name is John and he happens to be Indian. So it's more humanizing. We start to see people as individuals rather than because of their race or their religion. Okay, next. To encourage bonding, we have community centers and grassroots organizations helping to organize events and programs. If you live in an HDB block, once in a while, you know your parents will receive leaflets asking you to attend block parties. And these block parties are always held at the Void Deck. Or, you know, these leaflets ask you to go for special Lantern Festival events where they give out free mooncake. As I'm recording this now, there's a Ke Thai going on downstairs, so you might be able to hear some notes from the Ke Thai. Okay, all of this is to encourage mingling and bonding between people in the area. Oh, also, when you go to university, you will get to go on overseas exchange, which means you go to countries like Japan or Korea for like 4 to 5 months. And another student from Japan or Korea comes to Singapore to take your place for that same period. This exposes us to people from different cultures, and it teaches you to have mutual respect and tolerance for other people's races and religions. You become more accepting of differences. Remember I told you that xenophobia is the fear of what is foreign or strange? This is supposed to help combat xenophobia. Next. Okay, let's go back to common spaces. When you're free, you should ask your parents about how in the 1960s the government had a resettlement program. I don't know if your parents would remember that. People living in kampongs at that time had to move to HDB flats. And in 1989, the government came up with the Ethnic Integration Policy, which is basically what we know today as the HDB race quota. It means that each HDB block cannot have too many people of the same race. So for example, if my block consists like maybe 50%